And thank you all for your patience. I know I'm the only thing that stands between you and coffee, so I'll try to be as brief as possible. And thank you, Michele, for paving the way for a greater involvement of economists in cartel cases. Indeed, cartel is not an area in which economists have traditionally played a big role in antitrust authorities. If you imagine, you always think about the smoke-filled room where the agreement takes place. If you think about a room within the competition authority where the case team tries to to pursue the agreement, actually, that would be a room where economists would normally not be invited. There would be a lot of lawyers sitting around the table. But things have been changing recently, and economists are more and more involved in cartel cases, and especially, I'd say, in bid rigging cases. So when we think about bid rigging and the economics of bid rigging in terms of antitrust enforcement, let's make one thing clear. Bid rigging are not a category as such, different from other categories of agreements in terms of standard of proof or the type of economic analysis you would do. As Bill was saying, we try to apply the same framework that we apply to other cartel cases to bid rigging cases as well. So we try to think about reaching how companies reach the agreement, how they monitor the agreement, how they punish cheaters. Still, bid rigging as such has certain features, certain peculiarities that I think set it aside to other types of agreement. And in fact, when I approached the topic of these panel, I started to force myself to think what's different in a bid rigging cases to other cartel cases. So is there a different type of evidence we would look at? Would we do things differently? So let's apply this basic framework. For instance, I'd propose to think that perhaps in bid rigging cases, the first step plays really the central role, is reaching the agreement. And reaching the agreement meaning, in a way, agreeing on conduct, on bidding patterns, and as well on sharing the rent of those bidding patterns. So monitoring the agreement is probably easier in public procurement markets because bids are often published by the procurement agencies, so companies can observe directly the behavior of their competitors, check whether the agreement was complied with. When we think about reaching the agreement, also another feature that perhaps sets apart public procurement from other types of agreement is that companies face an increasingly well-aware and buyer. So public procurement agencies are increasingly aware of the potential risk of collusions, and indeed companies might of course put a lot of effort in trying to disguise the agreement. And in fact, as we develop better tools for screening and identified anomalies, so would firms, I think, endogenously adapt and improve their behavior. So we should never rest on our laurels and try to be as fast as companies in order to adapt our tools, to develop them in order to identify potential indices of collusion. So I want to be very practical. And I want to show you and to tell you how things would normally work in our experience. So we would start probably cases mostly after a complaint by a public body that has identified an anomaly in a particular tender procedure. In fact, after we published our vademecum in 2013, a lot of complaints were sent to the Italian competition authorities by different public procurement bodies highlighting particular anomalies in some tenders. So we would open, if we think that that evidence is enough to raise the serious doubt that there could be an infringement, we would open proceedings. And when we would open proceedings, the key thing we would do is to dawn raise. So we would go and inspect firms' premises to gather evidence that might be useful as proof of the cartel. So normally we start with some type of plus factor, some anomaly in behavior. So what we are trying to add is all the rest. And indeed, this is the crucial part of an investigation, because yesterday we talked a lot about screening and how we want to to make screening efficient and how we want to make screening able to identify exactly or with a great deal of precision collusion. So screening will never be perfect, and in any case, that particular anomaly would probably never be enough to prove a cartel. It might happen sometimes. So we always need to gather much more evidence, and the best tool we have to do that in cartels is really about dawn raids. In fact, I'll talk also about the type of economic evidence we would receive during proceedings. But if we find, spreadsheets that explain how firms have made their bids, why they've chosen to bid in some lots and not others, that's great evidence, and evidence we can place a lot of weight on. When we receive ex post economic models trying to rationalize what firms had done, we'll look at them with more suspicion. We have to, understand really what's going on in those models. So all the body of evidence that we gather is used in the proceedings together with hearings, trying to understand whether we are able actually to prove the agreement. And so the evidence that we've gathered, as already been said, ideally comprises of direct evidence. So we know that, for instance, there was a meeting between the companies and they were discussing exactly how to rig bids. That's the ideal evidence. We have a paper trail of that. So we know that companies made an agreement. We know that agreement restricts competition, job done. Unfortunately, as I was saying, companies are increasingly sophisticated also when it comes to antitrust prosecution. So unfortunately, direct evidence is not as easy to come by, especially when companies are, large companies bidding for large tenders that are well aware of the risk of potential antitrust scrutiny. So, and this is true for every form of cartel, increasingly, actually our proceedings are based on circumstantial evidence. So this is evidence which is consistent with the legal cartel activity. It's not really describing the exact terms of the agreement. We're not perhaps really able to identify the exact parties to it. And so how do we use it? We use it by way of deduction, common sense, economic analysis, logical inference from other facts which are demonstrated in order to conclude and to prove that an agreement took place. So, some examples of circumstantial evidence. Normally, two types. Communication. So we know that firms met, they communicated. We know that they talked perhaps about the subject. We don't really know that they were talking about exactly what bids to submit to the public body. So we use, meetings, internal documents that perhaps show knowledge of a competitor's pricing strategy, handwritten notes that mention allocation of tenders. This comes also, often used with economic evidence. And economic evidence is about evidence of how firms behaved on the conduct, and conduct that is consistent only with the expected conduct of a cartel. We look for facilitating practices, situations in which it is easier for firms to collude, and we look for structural evidence, again, features of market characteristics that are conducive to the existence and the stability of a cartel. So typically, when we run a case, we have bits and pieces of this type of evidence. We have some bits of communications from some firms. We have some economic and handwritten notes with indications of perhaps certain possible allocation of tenders. We don't know who wrote it. We don't know if that was exchanged between firms. How do we put all these things together? What's the approach we need to follow? And this is the approach. So the approach is well described by the OECD policy roundtables. So the methodology for evaluating circumstantial evidence is like an impressionist painting. Many dots, brushstrokes, which together form an image. Yes, that's easy when the image looks like this. Unfortunately, often the image looks like this. And so it is not clear, and the question is, how good does the image need to be in order to meet the standard of proof? So do we need really to be like Monet? So the standard of proof. So what is case law telling us about what we need to prove? So, the existence of the anti-competitive practice on agreement can be inferred, and see, this is the term that Bill used as well, from a number of indexes, coincidences, let's say circumstantial evidence, taken together, which, in the absence of another plausible explanation, are enough to be evidence of an infringement of competition rules. So, inferring multiple elements of evidence and absence of another plausible explanation. So these are the three key factors that we need to consider when we try to prove an agreement and a bid rigging case. So, and the weight of evidence is crucially based on its overall consistency. We'll go back to that at the end with some practical examples, rather than on the value of each individual item of evidence. So, cartel, we talked about parallel behavior. Perhaps we would run analysis of how prices evolve, the cost, the relationship between prices and costs as an economist. Bid rigging, what would we do? Okay, we have communication evidence, pretty important to be there, and a lot of economic evidence that we can put together. As I said, probably the case already started with some economic facts, with some anomaly that was identified. And in bid rigging cases, probably there are just three things that are crucial. And okay, structural factors. Okay, we need to have an environment in which bid rigging makes sense, in which it is sustainable. If we imagine two firms rigging bids and there are other 10 competitors out there, that's unlikely, to be a well-consistent story of a cartel, bid rigging cartel. However, structural factors, of course, adjust the basis. Two behavioral things. One behavioral is bidding patterns. Of course, probably this is where we started from. So probably this is where the anomaly was identified by the procurement body or by the authority running a screening test, which led to opening their proceedings. But also in bid rigging cases, it's probably important in the story that we're trying to tell a story about how rent are shared by the participants, because this is what the cartel is about. So it's about creating rents and about splitting them among the cartelists. So structural factors that we would look at. Many of these things you've already discussed a lot yesterday, so these are not different from the elements that we would look at when we try to screen for cartels. So the difference is in the standard of proof. The difference is in the way we need to put all these elements together, and thankfully we have the downwards and the evidence we collect through it in order to make a coherent story about bid rigging. It's not enough to say, well, this looks suspicious. There might be a probability of firms colluding. We need to prove that firms are colluding, so we cannot tolerate false positives as when you do screening. So screening, you can be quite lenient. Okay, I can identify a lot of situations in which I think there is collusion, but at the end of the day, there is not. When we do a case, we need to be sure that we don't identify false positives. So what structural factors? As I say, market structure, as Bill was saying, barriers to entry. If there are mavericks, of course, it's not easy to rig a cartels if there are new entrants acting as mavericks. We look at capacity constraints, if firms are similar to each other or not, geographical coverage. Okay, this is, as I said, give you an overview of the environment in which firms would collude. Well, I can hardly be decisive proof of collusion. I can't imagine any case, I always say perhaps, probably, often, well, but I really can't imagine many cases in which you would be able to base a decision on structural evidence. In bid rigging cases, one feature which is probably typical of bid rigging cases, and you don't have in normal markets, auction design. So in normal markets, firms compete, and we try to understand how the market works, what is, the way firms compete, how the interaction between firms and customers. Well, in these bid rigging cases, there is one particular feature. You, as procurement bodies, decide the way the market works. You design the auction. And designing the auction, has an impact, very direct impact on the ability and incentives of firms to collude, as well as on the intensity and nature of unilateral competition. So, for instance, you've run a tender and you've had no discounts. In Italy, you tender on discounts on a reserve price. So you might think, oh, well, this is very suspicious. Well, really, first thing is, was the tender constructed properly? I mean, in order to understand the behavior of firms, we need to understand how the tender was constructed. It was a sequential tender in which firms could have easily, tacitly colluded or not. So one key feature that we need to understand is how the tender was designed. Within that, a critical issue we would look at in these cases as economic evidence is the behavior of bidders. So classical forms, okay, boycott, no bids, selective bid, cover bids. So now, of course, you all know that these are potential indexes of collusion. So nothing new, you've talked a lot about this yesterday. So at this stage in the whole story, we will think a lot about potential alternative explanations. So now it's not enough to say, yes, there might be collusion. What we need really to do is to think really hard about, yes, but is there anything else that can explain it? So a lot of the analysis that we would do at this stage of the story, the proceedings, is about thinking and gathering evidence in order to be confident that the behavior we observe is consistent with the collusion and inconsistent with other potential alternative explanations. Because, for instance, we do not observe firms bidding for all lots. Well, firms do not have a duty to bid. And firms would come up to us and say, look, you know, lots are very different. I have a big advantages in this area of the country. I know a lot about customers. I have low costs. I want to bid there. Bidding is costly. Why do I have to bid in all lots? So we would have an analysis of these arguments. So if we have strong evidence collected through down rates, that's really helpful. If we don't, of course, parties would hire economic consultants, which would provide us with models trying to prove that, well, yes, exactly, there was the threshold whereby, you know, it was optimal to bid in those lots and was not optimal to bid in the other lots. And we would have, of course, a huge asymmetry of information with the parties. We would not know exactly what their costs. We would try to understand, however, and value and assess these arguments. And sometimes, however, arguments are also inconsistent. For instance, firms say, okay, you know, we didn't bid because it was not profitable. Yeah, and then when we bid, you know, okay, we just bid for different geographic territories because we are heterogeneous. Yes, but if you're so different, are you sure none of you really found it optimal to bid at the first place? So we would check for consistency among different possible explanations. And also, as I said, bidding patterns, we would look at outcomes. So, okay, what did we really observe? You know, incumbents won, you know, their tender where they were incumbents, geographical market segmentation, time-based allocation of tenders, contract value. Are these discounts large enough? Well, yes, it depends. Depends also on how the reserve price was defined by the procurement body. And also, big part of the story in bid rigging case is about rent sharing mechanisms, especially, and you must have these, especially when you were talking about rigging one big tender only. So if you're rigging one big tender, you must somehow find a way to share profits among, you don't have 10, 20, 30, 40 tenders, a sequential game, a sequential behavior in which you can, just balance your, positions. Yeah, so you need to find that. So you look at consortia, joint bidding, common ownership, as Bill was saying, subcontracting, side payments in some cases. And joint bidding is often a key in these cases. So we are, as a competition authority, we're well aware that joint bidding can have a pro-competitive use. It can also have an anti-competitive use. So we need to undertake a case-by-case analysis, and we need to put that joint bidding behavior within all the general framework of evidence that we have collected. So, as Michele was saying, the Italian Competition Authority has done a lot, actually, of bid rigging cases. This is just a list for the last 2 years. And really, these are cases in which we issue huge fines in the order of hundreds of million euros. Michele had a biased sample of decisions. I have not a sample, but one decision, very recent, which is peculiar. Because really, this is a case in which economic evidence played a huge role. So we really our evidence, the evidence we gathered through dawn raids was mainly economic. We didn't have a lot of proof about even firms communicating with each other, yet this decision was fully upheld by both the TAR and the Council of State. So this decision was about tenders for the disposal of asbestos in military arsenals. 12 undertakings, which were sharing the market, preserve their incumbency position, and leading to higher prices for the public sector. What type of economic evidence did we use? So we observed that these companies were previously competing. At some point they stopped competing and they started to form consortia. So these consortia were placing only one bid in each lot, very low rebates, just under or about 1%. And then also in terms of rent sharing, they were presenting themselves as consortia, and then they were having side contracts which were reallocating rents among them, probably in order not to make suspicious the consortia which behavior. So the parties, of course, came with a range of alternative explanations. Well, we were bidding jointly because we have a lot of complementary assets. It's good. We can exploit synergies. It's better for competition. Yeah, but then, you were the only one competing in each lot. There was not a lot really of competition. So but we couldn't really bid in all lots because we didn't have the resources. We had capacity constraints, and we didn't offer discounts because, the public sector is really, really slow in paying us. And we also, this is a bad time of the economy. We really needed to recoup past losses. So how do we distinguish? How do we compare this economic evidence with the alternative explanations? So one approach is to do it really item by item, and so if we are not happy, we discard each item. So the way we actually do it and the way the courts actually say we should do it is actually to think about it as in a holistic way. So the key really message is that in order to evaluate all the evidence we have is the narrative congruency, sorry for the awful English, but the consistency of the hypothesis of collusion. When we gather enough evidence to make this hypothesis the only one, or really the best one that appears to fit the facts, then we have the case. And so the paintings looks more like a Monet's rather than a childish one. Thank you.